What we've seen in our CEO survey is that CEOs in general have been more positive about the growth prospects of Africa and resultingly investments that we expect in the continent that they have been in the past few years. So I think, yes, we're changing gears and I think we're getting into a growth mode. We've seen a few things. The first, I think we've seen, as in the spirit of changing gears and focusing on growth again, combination of looking for organic opportunities, but also partnerships that allow access to markets and allow access to customers that otherwise you couldn't. So I think we see companies focusing on that. Interestingly, and this might sound counterintuitive, we also see many companies focusing on cost reduction. When we talk to our clients, we realize that's a little bit table stakes. You need to reduce costs in the markets where you're not being, where there are very limited growth opportunities, take South Africa, and use that to fund your investments elsewhere in the continent. So actually the cost reduction strategy is part of the growth play, but it's more of let's reduce costs and allow us to invest where it's needed. I think from a geographical perspective, we're seeing East Africa as an increasingly interesting market or interesting region in the continent because of its perceived independence from the commodity cycle. And I think that makes it very attractive for investors. From a sector perspective, we see increasing investments in new technologies and industries that can be scaled up very quickly and can be used to solve latent needs of the continent. One example of that is power generation, for instance, the use of solar panels and renewables to address issues with power distribution and power generation in different countries. Another interesting example is the use of, for instance, drones to distribute and distribute supplies, distribute medication across the continent to overcome some of the issues that we have with roads and transportation infrastructure. We're also seeing interest from other companies that would like to support the growth of technology. So, for instance, I work in financial services. Historically, most of the financial services players across the continent were quite expensive. I think there were very high valuations based on high expectations of growth in the continent. As those growth expectations have been dampened by the previous cycle and the current commodity cycle, valuations have become more reasonable. And I think a lot of players are now thinking, is now the time to acquire a company, is now the time to enter a JV in more reasonable terms, to enter these markets and potentially support the growth that we see in other sectors and capture some of that growth upside. I mentioned East Africa as a region that is very attractive given its perceived independence to the commodity cycle. I think there's a few countries in that region that are interesting from different angles. Ethiopia is interesting from the size, the potential size of the market, although it's going through a difficult time from a social-political perspective, and is also a difficult country to do business with. So I would say interesting, let's see how it develops. You have countries like Rwanda that are making amazing strides in terms of opening up to business, simplifying policies, making themselves more attractive to investors. On the other hand, they're small markets. So I think a lot of investors look at those countries with, on one hand, interest, but also some concern about the potential prospects. Kenya is the typical crown jewel of the region. I think the question is in everyone's mind is what's going to happen with the current political situation given the outcome of the elections. But if the outcome of the elections is positive in the sense of there's a stable political environment, there's a stable social environment, I think Kenya also is potentially the country to look at. If you put yourself in the shoes of an international investor, you have a country that is not growing very fast. It is clearly the largest market in Africa. We've seemed to have overtaken Nigeria again in terms of GDP growth, or GDP size. But in absolute terms, South Africa is the size of Belgium, I believe. And so if you're a company in UK, in Germany, in Japan, in the US, it's not dramatically, it's not a dramatic market, it's not something critical for you. The growth is not there. It's unstable from a political and regulatory environment, which is something that most international investors care about. A lot of people say that you can live with a bad regulatory regime as long as it's stable. At least you know what you're going for, you plan for it, and you adapt. And I think South Africa, the criticism is not necessarily a bad regulatory regime. In many ways, it's actually one of the most stable, one of the most robust, but it's unstable. And I think that scares a lot of investors. And lastly, there aren't many sectors and latent needs that have not been served effectively by local players. It's not that you can go to South Africa and say there's a latent market of millions and millions of customers that is not being served in an effective manner by local companies. So you start looking at this, is there a white space in the market? Not necessarily. Can we see a white space in the market being developed in the future? Not necessarily, because the country is not growing. Is it attractive? Not necessarily, because from a regulatory standpoint, unstable. From a size perspective, yes, but in the bigger scheme of things, if you're an international corporation, there are more interesting markets. So you weigh all of this, and it's a bit difficult to make a case for South Africa.